Hello, it's Wednesday, October 7th. I am Ann Fenlason, pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Long Lake, Minnesota. Very glad that you could stop by here this morning. You can see my cat Lulu. She's back scratching at the door there. So we'll welcome Lulu into our time together today. But I've been thinking about the Holy Spirit a lot lately. And I know I've talked about the Spirit before, but it's always worth talking about the Holy Spirit. And especially how the Holy Spirit is really such a huge part of the book of Acts. It's called Acts of the Apostles, but sometimes we know it as Acts of the Holy Spirit. So just a reminder that Acts is a continuation of Luke's gospel. They believe the same person wrote Acts as wrote the Gospel of Luke. And Acts is this grand narrative of how people act out the call to be witnesses. Because Jesus, before he ascends to heaven, he says, "You will be my witnesses." And that is not a command as much as it is a declaration. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at that. That certainly Jesus commands us to go spread the good news, but it's a declaration also. You're going to be my witnesses. And it's an interesting way to look at that a little bit differently. So this Acts is the story of the early church, the first followers of Christ, and we see that the Holy Spirit comes to them in Pentecost, right? Let me remind you of what that story is. It's chapter 2 of Acts. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting, the disciples, the apostles, the followers. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. So the Holy Spirit is really a new relationship that we have with God. And it brings people together. The role of the Spirit is to bring us together, to bring community together. So the story of Acts focuses on key leaders, Peter and Paul mostly, Stephen a little bit. We get Peter for maybe about the first half of the book, and then he's no longer around. And so it's mostly about Paul from basically about chapter 7 through the end. So why I've been thinking about this lately is that Acts is about the early church, and the early church was built from the ground up. They had no blueprint for church, right? And so we're seeing how the church is made. So we get stories where people have made mistakes. We get stories of amazing things that have happened. And all of these stories reflect a discernment about the work of the Holy Spirit. And usually the discernment of how the Spirit was in what happened comes after the event. So when they're looking back on it, they're like, oh, that's how the Holy Spirit was active in this. And I think the same holds true for us today, that oftentimes when the Spirit is making something happen for the glory of God, that often when we're in the middle of it, we don't know that the Spirit's a part of it. It's when we have to look back that we see that. Sometimes for me, I know when the Spirit has been at work in something that I have been a part of. I usually have a more difficult time of remembering something that I've said. Like if I think a prayer has been particularly effective, I generally, and I can't remember what it was I said, I attribute that to the work of the Holy Spirit working through me. That's just for me. You might have a different experience entirely. So the basic message throughout Acts is it tells us what happens when the resurrection message gets out of the box. And also that the Spirit does not work in isolation. We are a part of that Spirit's work. So what this says to us today, I thought was pretty poignant, because we today are building church from the ground up. Everything's new because of COVID, and we've had to kind of start over and figure things out. And there have been some wonderful things that have been happening at Trinity that I know many of you have been a part of. And one of these days I'll go through a litany of what I believe the Spirit has been a part of in our work here. But I encourage you to be on the lookout for the work of the Spirit, because the fun way of looking at Acts, it's a book that's 28 chapters long, but it doesn't end there. It hasn't even ended yet, actually. That story of those who are following Jesus and the work of the Spirit through those who follow Jesus, that story has continued for thousands and thousands of years, and it will continue on as well. I think that's really remarkable. So friends, go out into this day and know that the Holy Spirit is leading the way for us. There we go. All right, I'll see you at church. How's that? Bye-bye.